Why do people vote? Why do they do anything? Why do I do anything? Existential problems aside, a lot of research has gone into figuring out why people vote and how we, and by we I mean political parties, can get people to get out to the polls. Classically, thinkers have thought of people who didn't vote or voted against their, quote, interests were fundamentally irrational. And they thought of this irrationality as harmful in a linear way, or in plain English, the more irrational you were, the more harm that you were doing. So if you take, for example, a doctor, if he overdiagnoses a disease by 20%, that's bad, but if he overdiagnoses that disease by 95%, that's like really bad, and he can have his medical license revoked. When applying this framework to voting behavior, what researchers have done is they have asked people to fill out questionnaires about their political priorities, and then compared to that data on who they voted for and whether or not they actually voted at all. Unsurprisingly, their stated opinions weren't always correlated with how they actually acted out on voting day. These researchers often wrote off these people as irrational, but there are definitely flaws with this model. First of all, how do you measure political priorities or political interests in an objective way? You simply can't. And second of all, how can you be certain that a person's vote, their singular vote, has any major impact on their life? And so in the year 2000, researcher Brian Kaplan attempted to address these flaws and introduced what he called the Rational Irrationality Model. While this model is used to talk about many different subjects, voting is probably the most straightforward example of this idea in action. Rational irrationality takes into account two additional pieces of context when we try to understand whether or not human beings are acting rationally. First of all, irrational thinking can have a low cost. When a person faces little to no cost for acting in an irrational manner, is it really fair to say that they're acting irrationally when they don't correct their bias? Additionally, there's a difference between social cost and personal cost. Some behaviors can be socially damaging, while others can be personally damaging. Take smoking for an example. Smoking can be very bad for you as an individual, but as long as you're not lighting up near a kindergarten, you're not really hurting anyone else. Voting is the opposite. Your vote might not have a personal impact on you, but it does have a large societal impact. No matter who you are, your vote will always have more social impact than personal impact. Additionally, rationality can have a high cost. We're all just human beings with a limited capacity for thought, so we can't be expected to be perfectly rational beings at all times. So that's where the model gets its name. Sometimes it's more rational to be irrational. As we said before, voting has a big societal impact, but has little personal reward for the 66% of Americans who actually participate in that behavior. Voting also represents what's called high friction or high transaction cost. Transaction friction refers to the cost of making a transaction beyond the monetary value of the goods and services that are being exchanged. For a good example, think of one-click shopping websites. The goal of a one-click shopping website is to remove as much transaction friction as possible by taking out the steps between you and the purchase of the item. They're hoping that you will commit to a purchase before you actually even realize it. In the case of voting, getting informed about the issues and figuring out when and where you're supposed to fill out your ballot are examples of transaction costs that are associated with voting. This transaction cost can even vary from state to state and neighborhood to neighborhood. Almost every time you see a voter turnout campaign, it's almost always done by a left-wing organization. This is because three of the biggest parts of the modern Democrat coalition have a long history of being kept away from the polling booth or are otherwise more sensitive to the transaction cost associated with voting. African Americans have a long history of being kept away from the polling booths. Poll tests, voter registration purges, and poll taxes, which is a literal cost, have been used to increase the transaction cost for black voters. Latino voters, especially older ones, often need translation services to parse through very technical voting documents. And then there are also modern challenges. Voter ID laws aim to increase the transaction cost for voters who are least able to pay it. It takes time to get a photo ID, and that's a lot of time that some people simply don't have. And it's the same thing for mail-in ballots or early voting. Making these easier, making these more accessible, can help alleviate the transaction costs associated with voting. So that's it. We're just too lazy and stupid to figure out our own civic duty. Well, that's not the whole story, isn't it? Our media apparatus is flawed in very particular ways that cause two distinct political sides to form. The word of the day is existential. Voter behavior is largely determined by the issues that people feel are existential. Right now, for the right, these issues are wokeness and abortion, things like that. And after the overturning of Roe v. Wade and in a post-Donald Trump world, democracy and abortion have become forefront in the minds of a lot of the political left. One of the reasons there was so much voter turnout in the 2010 midterm elections was a backlash to Obama. And to the right, Obama's policies, and Obama as a person, as a black man sitting in the White House, felt like an existential threat to the right side of the political spectrum. The 2018 midterm elections were an existential election for the left, because they saw Donald Trump as a threat to democracy, and well, I mean, they were right. In that election, young voter turnout surged because standing up for economic justice and fighting the fascist that found his way into the White House became a more visible threat, and so they came out and vote because they felt that it was an existential issue. The reason why politicians, especially Republicans, signal to these sort of existential wedge issues is because it is the most reliable way of getting people to turn out and the most reliable way of getting them engaged in the broader political process. So I, and probably you if you're watching this, we're weird. We're political junkies. We like to keep up with the news. We like to keep up with everything that's going on, but most people aren't us, and most people get their information based off of whatever they happen to come across. Based on whatever experiences and personality traits that somebody comes into the political process with, they usually latch on to one or the other narrative and then make their voting decision based on whether or not it's worth it to jump through all the hoops to try to get out there to vote. If you're ever confused about why people hold a set of very almost conflicting political views, well, it's probably because they're not as informed as you. And that doesn't make them stupid, it makes them normal.